Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the final in our three-part series on the Federal Reserve System. I'm Lydia Mashburn, Policy Director for Chairman Paul's Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy. On behalf of the Congressman in his office, thank you for joining us today. In the first two parts of this series, we learned why the Fed was created and what the Fed does. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there were a series of banking panics which led to cries for reform. Unfortunately, the real problem of government intervention in the banking system was not addressed, and as government tends to do, they responded to a government-created problem with more government and our central bank. So we then learned how our central bank conducts monetary policy, how the Fed attempts to navigate the booms and busts of the business cycle by providing money and credit to the economy when it's sluggish and contracting money and credit when it's overheated, or so the story goes. The Fed, as our economic mandarin, however, fails to see that it's responsible for those very booms and busts in the economy that we suffer from. We have seen, especially in the last few years, how the Federal Reserve has indeed not been as successful as we are led to believe in managing the economy. And today we are going to learn just how bad of a record they have and where it is taking us, and hopefully a few recommendations to brighten the outlook on our monetary future. Dr. Roger Garrison is going to be answering today's question, what is the Fed's future? He is Professor Emeritus at Auburn University. He is the author of Time and Money, the Macroeconomics of Capital Structure. Over his long academic career, he has been studying Keynesian economic modeling, which actually informs nearly every aspect of our modern understanding of monetary policy. And how we can supposedly control our economy and manage our economy through monetary policy. Dr. Garrison, I think he's deftly illustrated in his own modeling the consequences of monetary policy on the marketplace. And as I hope we'll see today, we'll see what those consequences really mean and what they mean for the Fed and what they should mean for us going forward into the future with our Federal Reserve System and our own monetary structure. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Garrison.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Well, the future of the Fed and the necessity for reform, I could just as well have titled this talk, Why the Time is Right for Monetary Reform, with this unending sequence of booms and busts, and particularly with the characteristics of this latest downturn, the housing crisis. The Fed has painted itself into a corner, or maybe I should say printed itself into a corner, with interest rates at zero. They've been at zero for over 3 years now and will be in zero for the foreseeable future. I think the Federal Reserve has announced through 2014, isn't it, for zero rate. This is not the sign of a healthy economy. And so therefore it's time for reform. Now, the reform I'm talking about is not going to be a new way to target interest rates, or it's not going to be a new way to measure the money supply. But rather, I'm looking at polar alternatives, and we can present them here. One is government money in the central bank, and that's what we have now. And the second is private money in decentralized banking. So this is the radical nature of the reform that I'm proposing. As I develop my arguments, what I want you to pay attention to is the interest rate and the role of the interest rate in a market economy and the role of the interest rate at the Federal Reserve. They're at war with one another, as we'll see. So if I subscript this, boy, I can't read that. I hope you can off the screen. But this is interest rate, the central bank in which interest rates served as a policy tool for the central bank. Essentially, the central bank has commandeered the interest rate to serve as its own policy tool, which means it can no longer work as it should be working in the market economy. If you look at the private money and decentralized banking, that's a system in which the interest rates allocate resources, what does that say, in conformity with people's preferences and decisions. In other words, it's a market-determined rate, not a policy-determined rate. The big difference between the two is that the market will give you sustainable growth, while the central system will give you boom and bust. And throughout this lecture, I use the word sustainable a number of times, but in a macroeconomic context, and this is certainly in Austrian economic theory, sustainable just means no booms and busts. Okay, you don't have a boom that contains the seeds of its own undoing and goes bust. That's what we mean by sustainable growth. Much of the discussion today, much of the analysis, will take the form of a contrast between Keynesian economics, in which it's recommended that the interest rate be a policy tool to guide the economy and to dampen booms and busts. It does quite the opposite, of course. And Hayek, who is the Austrian economist, and argues against interest rate manipulation, and argues instead that in a market economy, the interest rate will seek its own level, and that level will give us a sustainable growth rate in the economy. So this is a study in comparative frameworks, and you'll see what a contrast there is between the Keynesians on the one hand and the Austrians on the other. I start out with the Keynesians and recognize that the central bank and government money is the handmaiden of Keynesian policymaking. Fiscal policy, of course, comes into play here too, but more often than not, the monetary policy is supporting fiscal policy by creating the money for the government to spend. The framework is called a circular flow framework, and we'll discuss that shortly. We'll see pictures of it shortly. But before we do that, I want to look at the policy tools that the Fed currently has. It's called the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, as spelled out by legislation largely in Humphrey Hawkins in 1978. Dual mandate. I'm going to show you all three of them. Stable prices is one, although stable doesn't necessarily mean constant. In fact, it doesn't for Ben Bernanke and others. Maximum employment. Those are the two that you hear a lot of talk about. Those are the two that get discussed at every policy meeting by the Fed. But there's a stealth mandate in the legislation too, and it's sustainable economic growth. And we'll see why it's stealth. It's not so much of a mandate as a nagging concern. Okay, there's a nagging concern that maybe policy actions taken with respect to the first two items in the mandate aren't consistent with achieving that third mandate. So it doesn't get discussed very much. Let's look at the targets here. Stable prices, conventionally, that's taken to mean a 2% rate of inflation. Now, if my talk today was a more nutsy-boltsy talk about the day-to-day operations of the Fed, I would take issue with the notion that we need a 2% inflation. But we've got bigger fish to fry here today, and so I'm going to pass that by. How do you get your 2% inflation? Well, you use the policy tool, namely the federal funds rate of interest, the rate that the Fed has substantial control over. This is the rate that they have down to zero or very near zero right now. And of course, when we talk about the interest rate as a tool, what we're really talking about is the money that needs to get pumped out into the economy to drive the interest rate down to zero, okay? Which, as we'll see, is quite a little bit of money. So our focus is narrowly on the interest rate, but more broadly on the monetary expansion that is needed to bring interest rates down to where the Fed wants it. That's the policy tool. Now let's look at maximum unemployment or maximum employment. The target implicitly is 5 to 6% rate of unemployment. Typically, this is discussed not so much in terms of the unemployment rate, but in terms of what's called the GDP gap. You know, how far is GDP now actually from where potentially it could be? And if those two things differ, though, it's because there's unemployment. And so we can list that target as the unemployment rate. Well, now what tool do they use to hit that target? Well, it's the same one, okay? It's the same policy tool. It's the Fed funds rate. The problem is that sometimes the Fed funds rate needs to go one way to hit the maximum employment target. It needs to go the other way to hit the inflation target. So that's always a big problem. And it's been handled in different ways, as we'll see shortly. Now, I'll say a little bit about sustainable growth, but I can't say too much because the Fed certainly doesn't say too much. And the implicit target on growth is what? Not too high and not too low. Well, we're not sure what that is. And as we'll see later on in this lecture, and we might as well start now, that the Fed claims, as Greenspan often claimed, that you don't know if you're in a bubble until it bursts. That was his claim made during the housing bubble. That was the claim made during the dot-com bubble. You just don't know. You can't tell until it bursts. And when it bursts, then, oh, well, you're in a bubble, okay? So what I'll suggest here is that another way of saying that is that you don't know whether you're fostering sustainable growth or not, because those are two ways of saying the same thing. If you've got sustainable growth, then you're not in a bubble. If you don't know whether you're in a bubble, then you don't know whether you have sustainable growth. And so it's a nagging concern. They don't have a policy tool. I put tool in quotes here, just to say the only tool that will work is the market rate of interest. You have to let interest be set in the market, and that will give you sustainable growth. But that's not something that the Fed can do because it's controlling interest rates. And instead, you're hearing just a lot of whistling in the dark about whether the growth is sustainable or not, okay? Now, at the risk of traumatizing some of you people who have had a course in macroeconomics, how many have had a college-level course in macroeconomics? So you know what this is all about, the circular flow framework. And I want to present it in such a way to give it the best contrast between the Keynesians and the Austrians. And it goes like this. You have business firms, that's just a facilitator. It facilitates the interaction between the different sectors of the economy, between consumers and investors and workers. And then down below here you have those groups, workers, investors, consumers, and so on. And you know how the circle works. It turns out the workers supply labor and other resources. This is a common expression of Keynes, labor and other resources. But he pretty much forgets those other resources and argues strictly in terms of labor. So labor is supplied to the firm. Well, fine, they get paid for it. It's called income, and that's half of the circular flow. If you look at the other side, there it is. At the firm, that labor is used to produce goods and services, which is offered for sale to investors or to consumers, and they pay for that, and it's called expenditures. Okay, where'd my expenditures go? Here it is. There's expenditures, okay? Now what I want to use the circular flow for, look at the labor side. if there's a change in labor, at least if it's in the downward direction, change in labor income, that's because there's unemployment. Wage rates tend not to fall, and you get unemployment. And so over there, we want to look for unemployment. On the other side, we have expenditures. If you have changes over there, at least if it's on the upside, then you get inflation. So that's a part of the thing to look for, inflation. One thing we see already is that the interest rate hasn't made its entrance. There's no interest rate. But we can get the interest rate in, but it's a policy tool. And there it is. There's the Federal Reserve. It's a policy tool. And if it has interest rates high, looks like about 6%, it's going to be a pretty sluggish economy. You're probably going to have unemployment. If it gets the interest rates low, well, it'll be a more vigorous economy, but then you get inflation. So let's get this thing started. See, there. See, my circular flow actually circulates, but it's circulating pretty slow, and so sure enough, unemployment's on the rise. What do the policymakers do with it? What do they do for that? Well, lower the rate. Well, you learn well, and you lower the rate. As they switch it over there, now you get a very vibrant economy, and unemployment goes down. Oh, unfortunately, inflation goes up. All right. Now, you noticed I label those 2% and 6% as brake and gas. That's in honor of Milton Friedman, who complained all during the 60s and 70s that the Federal Reserve hit the brake, hit the gas, hit the brake, hit the gas, and gave us ups and downs in the economy. And in fact, now we've got inflation high. That would be the late 70s when G. William Miller was chairman of the Fed, and he got inflation up to the double digits. And they finally got rid of him. Jimmy Carter called in Paul Volcker, and Volcker had the solution on how to deal with the inflation. What was it? Okay, it was go back to high interest rates, okay? And of course, it gave you the other result again. So that's the 60s and 70s where we had a lot of hit the gas, hit the brake, which was followed by another period that's called the Taylor Rule. How many have heard of the Taylor Rule? You know something about the Taylor Rule, okay? And it goes like this: don't just hit one then the other back and forth. That's a losing proposition. What you need to do is figure out just how to split the difference and how to set an interest rate that does something for both of those problems. And so the idea is split the difference between fighting unemployment and fighting inflation. It's what I've come to call, and I'll show you this later, but I'll use the term here, a learning by doing process. But it gave rise to what came to be called the Great Moderation. This was a term coined in 1999 by Charles Nelson, but was popularized in 2004 by Ben Bernanke when he was one of the governors, not the chairman of the Fed. So the Great Moderation. And that was a period where they weren't quite so bad at hitting the brake and hitting the gas. So let me show you a chart to see how that plays out. What we're looking at is the growth rate of GDP. And squint your eyes and look at the chart and see if you can see that great moderation. Yeah, if you look at that boxed in area, a little bit yellow area, whatever it is, it looks like the variation isn't quite as bad as it was before. Although there's some pretty bad things. You see first, you see the savings and loan crisis, although that was predominantly a problem with the FDIC rather than the Federal Reserve. You see the dot-com bust, and then finally you get outside the box and you see the housing crisis. So that has to be the end of the Great Moderation. There's nothing moderate about the housing crisis. Now, it's interesting to learn how Taylor came up with his rule. He didn't write the article until 1993, and that's well into the period that's called the Great Moderation. And what he did was look at data, look at what the Federal Reserve was actually doing, starting with about 1985. And he wrote an equation that described what the Fed was doing. Did they raise rates or lower rates depending on what unemployment was and what inflation was? And how did they trade off one against the other and choose a rate? And he wrote an equation that fitted those decisions. And he said, this is the equation that shows what the Fed has been doing. It was just descriptive. Okay, fine. And so, but he managed to turn an is into an ought. And the way he did it is to tell the Fed, look, if you're happy with what you were doing, then here's how to keep doing it. Just apply the Taylor rule, and then you'll be doing the same thing you've been doing for the last several years. Now, the Fed didn't ever explicitly adopt the Taylor rule, but implicitly it did. Okay. Now, the problem is, and this is where the learning by doing comes in, that the doing part is once every 6 weeks when the Federal Open Market Committee meets. And in that yellow block there's about 184 doings. But the learning comes much less frequently, just every time there's a crash. Okay? So you have a lot of doing before you get learning, and so I think we can put that across the street, or across the screen here. There's a little bit of learning there, a little more learning there, and then a big lesson there, okay? Which says for the whole period they really weren't doing so hot, but they didn't figure that out until the end. And again, it's another episode of you don't know that you're doing the wrong thing until it goes bust. You don't know you're in a boom until the bust. But you do know that those interest rates you're setting are not market rates. They're not market rates. And we also know there's a political bias to have them lower rather than higher. So it's not at all surprising that you get still more boom-bust episodes. And this one was a particularly bad one, the housing. More to say about that later. Okay, so I'm saying it's time to stop that stuff, okay? And we need something else. So let's look at private money and decentralized banking. And here I call it the safe zone for the Hayekian system as described by what I've come to call capital-based macroeconomics. I use that term in Time and Money, and it tends to have caught on some in the literature, which I'm pleased about. And it's not that I don't like to use the word Austrian. I do use it sometimes, the Austrian theory. It's Mises and Hayek. In fact, I probably have a picture of them here somewhere. Is it right? There they are, okay. Mises and Hayek. Mises wrenched this theory into existence 100 years ago. It's an old theory, and Hayek developed it in the late 20s and through the 30s. And so it deserves to be called an Austrian theory. But I learned, at least at Auburn University, it confused the students. They either thought it was the economics of Austria, or some of them thought it was Australia. So I thought, well, okay, capital-based macroeconomics, we'll go with that. Now, I've got sequence one. I'm going to have sequence one and sequence two. In honor of Hayek and his methodological maxim. He said this to Keynes, before you can figure out what might go wrong in the economy, you first have to understand how it could ever go right. And just saying that sounds right, doesn't it? But Keynes rejected that maxim, as have a lot of other economists. So sequence one is showing how the economy can work right with a market rate of interest. All right? And then sequence two is just a corollary, really. It's a corollary. It's what happens when the rate of interest is not controlled by the markets. Well, things go wrong, okay? So let's look at this first sequence and we'll see how it works. The interest rate's determined by the market. There's a supply of savings, it turns out. It's upward sloping like most other supplies. And the demand for loanable funds is the business community borrowing in order to invest. And if interest rates are allowed to seek their own level, then of course you have a market clearing interest rate. But let's think for just a minute about what this means when you say, you know, you memorized it in college that saving equal investment in equilibrium. Okay, saving equal investment. But what does that mean? Think of what saving means. People go to work and they produce things. They produce output. They get paid for it. It's called income. They spend part of that income on the output they've created collectively. And they save the rest. Well, this saving the rest represents the unconsumed output. It's what you produced during the period but didn't consume. And it's that unconsumed output that can be used by the business community to enhance the productivity of the economy. And they borrow your savings in order to take command of that unconsumed output. So that's the equivalence that you need. You need that unconsumed output, real output, in order to build the productive capacity of the economy. So that's why economic growth, sustainable growth, requires that rate of interest is telling the truth about how many resources there are out there for businesses to take command of, okay? Otherwise, they may undertake too many business projects and discover they can't complete them all, okay? In fact, that's the essence of the Austrian theory. Now, say suppose people become more future-oriented, and sometimes I think I have to say that apologetically because Keynes argued that no, people are creatures of habit. They don't just decide to save more. Well, maybe they do, okay? Maybe they do, to pay for their children's education or to pay for travel after retirement or to pay for the retirement center or whatever it is, you know. So if they do, then look what happens. You have a shift of that supply curve to the right. It drives down the interest rate and increases the level of saving and investment, okay? So what we have here is more saving is available because people have decided to save more. The interest rate is lower, which entices business community to borrow the saving. And it also, this is importantly, it particularly stimulates long-term projects. And for two reasons. One is that long-term projects have a disproportional cost of interest payments. If you've got to borrow money to fund that project, and it's going to take a long time to finish it, then you've got to be paying interest while you're working on the project. So for that reason, long-term projects are favored. And also partly because people are saving now, but they're saving up for something. You're going to have more spending power in the future. And so you want your future output to be a little further in the future, which you get by having long-run projects. So that's the way that interest rate guides the allocation of resources. Okay. Now, and you can see the resources are freed up to undertake these long-term projects because people are saving. They're not consuming as much as what they have produced, all right? Now, let's look at the structure of production. This is the capital part of capital-based macroeconomics. It has a distinct time element in it. In other words, we don't have a circular flow. We've got a means-ends framework with the production process going through a number of stages until it emerges as consumable output. Hayek introduced that as a triangle like that, showing 5 stages of production, just for pedagogical reasons. And that first stage to the left doesn't amount to much because you're just getting started. There's just some early stage in the production process. That's why it has a small height. but the output of that stage feeds in as input to the next stage. And the output of the next stage feeds in as input to all the way up until the end, in which case the output is consumable output, all right? That's Hayek's structure of production. So you can think of early stage as product development, okay? Looks like this guy knows what he's doing, but it's going to be a long time before that shows up as consumable output, all right? It's a long-term. Now that's short-term. That's inventory management. And that guy looks like he knows what he's doing too. He needs a few customers, I think, but he's got the store stocked, all right? Now, so those two things, of course, both can be going on at the same time. It's just that the early stage is aimed at a more distant point in the future. But you can think of goods and services working their way through the stages of production. Let's see if we can do something like that. Watch the resources, goods and process move through the stages of production. There, see, it does something like that. Now, this is a theory, I think I mentioned this, it was developed in '31 by Hayek. That was the last year that Henry Ford made the Model A. It's kind of sad. But I use the Model A as an example here because if you know anything about Henry Ford, he owned all the stages. You know, he had iron ore fields and everything else between there and the finished output. So if Hayek had wanted to, he could show production of Model A's with this same, let's see, it goes like this. There they are, okay. But you get the idea how it works. Now, we put these two things together and we show what happens in the market economy when people decide to save more. I'm going to step up the pace a little bit because I might be running short of time. When people save more, they send two messages to the market. One is interest rates lower, which means favors long-term projects. Two is current consumption is down, which means that last stage, those last few stages are disfavored, okay? So let's watch that again. You've seen it once already, you know what it looks like. And then see how that affects separately the individual stages in that structure of production. It goes like this. Okay, and you can see why, because if people are saving more now, that means they're not consuming as much. If they're not consuming as much, you don't have to stock as much at retail. So your investment in inventory at retail is going to go down, all right? But at the same time, that low interest rate makes it more profitable to undertake long-term projects, which can then be sold to these people who are saving up that money, all right? So that's the market at work for you and for me. That's how markets work. That's what Hayek meant when he says, first we have to see how things go right, if they do go right, and then we can talk about how things might go wrong. So that takes me to sequence 2. Looks the same, doesn't it? Okay. But here, we're getting something very different, but it's significant that it almost looks the same. That instead of people saving more, we have a central bank pumping money through credit markets, shifting that supply of credit to the right, but without really affecting anybody's saving. The sequence I'm using here, the example I'm using, is what we call a political business cycle theory. In other words, the interest rate is what it is, it's not changing, but the central bank decides to lower it, maybe for political effect. An example would be Arthur Burns in '72, who helped Nixon get reelected by lowering interest rates. And that same Arthur Burns, though, 4 years later, didn't help Gerald Ford, who, of course, lost. In an interview, it was pointed out that this is what Burns had done, and Burns was asked to explain why didn't Why didn't he help Ford like he helped Nixon? And Burns says, he didn't ask me. Ford didn't ask me. Okay. We see another instance of this when Greenspan helped Clinton get reelected in 1996. But 4 years earlier, he didn't help Bush 41 at all. And there's still bad blood between those two because of that. Okay. So anyhow, we've got a different kind of a process here. Let's see if we can detect the difference. I'm going to create money and pump it out through credit markets. Greenspan. Okay. So when that happens, it looks like there's more saving, but there isn't. There's just more credit. And in fact, saving goes the other way. The saving curve is just where it was before, and with the interest rate lower, people save less. So you drive a wedge between saving and investment. That's probably what that says. Okay. And so you've got a disequilibrium. And in fact, if you look at that horizontal line that goes through those two disequilibria points, it looks kind of like a price ceiling, doesn't it? You remember price ceilings in class? In which case you'd say there's a big shortage of credit, all right? And the only reason the shortage doesn't show up is because it's literally papered over by the central bank, who creates the money to lend that larger amount to investors, all right? But that also means then that that's an unsustainable boom. It festers. It's not a shortage that has an immediate impact. It's an artificial boom that festers until eventually it turns into bust because there aren't enough resources to support that much investment. Okay, let's look at, here I'm just showing you. Investors go down along their demand curve, savers down along their supply curve, and the difference is the money created to make good on the difference. Look at the structure of production. It's torn at both ends too. It turns out that the lower interest rate will stimulate long-term projects, but they can't all be finished because there aren't enough resources to finish them. The reduction in saving and therefore increase in consumption will send some resources to the late stages. So you get a distorted triangle, which essentially contains the seeds of its own undoing. That will eventually collapse. Mises even had the terminology for this. He called the beefing up of early stages malinvestment. In other words, doesn't reflect real saving, reflects Federal Reserve policy. And the upper reaches he called overconsumption, is that people are buying more even though there are less resources available than before. Okay. Now, when the Fed looks at this, they don't look at the capital part because they don't know anything about the Austrian theory. They're just looking at the saving and investment and interest rate. And so they see the economy going in the dumper because the economy crashed. And the reaction is, guess what? Lower interest rates. So they lower interest rates further and end up locking in the malinvestment, big time the housing market this time, rather than letting the housing market liquidate itself. It kept more resources in housing than had any justification at all. Okay. Now, I have a few, how much time do I have? A little bit or not?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. So I'm gonna just clip through this because this, I don't ask you to read it. I'm not going to give you time to read it, but this is different economists, Axel Landhofen, claiming that our recent cycles are Austrian and not Keynesian. Same for Steve Hanke. I like that one just because he looks so stern. I can't look that stern, but Hanke can. And he has a little synopsis of the housing bust and says it was an Austrian affair. okay? I like this guy's title, Ignoring the Austrians Got Us Into the Mess, all right? All right. Now, I do want to show this one, and then I'll quit. I want to show you why the recent boom bust was so much worse than the dot-com boom bust. That typically, it's not just a political business cycle. It starts out as an increase in demand for loanable funds because of innovations like the digital revolution. If you have a digital revolution like we had in the 90s, you'll get an increase in the demand for loanable funds to take advantage of the innovations. And you can see what that does. That calls forth saving. People slide up that saving curve, and that finances the innovations. But the Fed won't leave that alone. The Fed sees the interest rate rise and it'll drive it back down. So it increases the supply of loanable funds. What does that do? That knocks that saving in the head. And it leverages the investment. So you're back to an unsustainable boom. That was the dot-com boom and bust. It wasn't quite so bad because there really was a welfare-enhancing development underlying the boom, namely the digital revolution. Okay, it was great. Now, things are different with the housing boom and bust, because what underlay that wasn't an innovation, it was a distortion of housing markets. It was subsidizing risk-taking, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, all right? And so the initial distortion, not welfare enhancing, was distorting housing markets. Now, if that's all that had happened, that would have shifted resources out of other sectors into housing. But those other sectors would have been hurting. And so the Fed made good on that by, guess what? Increasing the money supply. So you have a double whammy. You have the Fed now increasing the money supply when in fact it was the supply of loanable funds, which was brought about by guaranteeing mortgages in the first place. So you have a double decrease in interest rates. That's why interest rates were so low, all right? And in fact, there I'm showing even at that low interest rate, saving is driven clear to zero, which it was during the boom. I do a little bit of stock taking, and then with that interest rate at zero, we're on life support, and you can see that interest rate too low for too long. That was during the housing boom. And then the interest rate shot up because the Fed realized it had messed up. And then when the crash came, of course, it lowered it to zero, which means essentially the economy's on life support. I think maybe I'll stop here and take questions, although I've got more charts I can throw at you anytime I want to. Yes?
Thank you very much for a great critique of the present system. I was just wondering, have you seen the study by Carpenter and Demirel, which shows empirically that the Fed doesn't really have any control over the system at the moment? The banks lead and the Fed follows.
I haven't seen that report, but I think that's true. But the reason it's true is because the central bank has already pumped the banks full of reserves. The reserves are just astronomically high. And if you remember your monetarism from your macro course, the way that the Fed controlled the money supply or controlled the economy was on the assumption that banks would be fully loaned up, that they wouldn't hold excess reserves, okay? And now they're holding tremendous amounts of excess reserves. You played right into my hands. I think I've got there's those excess reserves, 1.5 trillion. In fact, it looks better on the axis. You see that's excess reserves down to zero, and then boom, you know, that's the excess reserves. And with those reserves, then he lost control of things. But that's another reason it's time for a reform.
Yeah, because this basically shows that the money multiplier, which a lot of economists have been assuming from their textbooks, has been inapplicable since at least the late 1950s.
That's right.
Yeah. And follow-up question related to that is, in your model, you have savings equaling investments, but in the present banking system, every new bank loan or bank purchase creates a new deposit. It doesn't transfer a previous deposit from anywhere. So how does that affect your model when you apply it to the current situation?
I'd have to think about that. I think that if you're talking about a situation where there is a change in the reserve ratio, then you get that kind of a result.
Well, I mean, going back to this shows that changing the reserve ratio has no effect when there was only 20 billion in reserves. Banks were creating about $1 trillion, and now there's 1.6 trillion in reserves, and the banks are not creating much at all.
That's right. That's right. Certainly correct about that. I will say about when you look at this chart on the board, Bernanke has said a number of times that he's confident about his exit strategy. Have you heard that comment made? And what that means, most of you probably know this, but what that means, he's confident that he can suck those reserves out of the banking system if they actually start lending it out. Okay, he's confident about his exit strategy. At a conference not long ago, where several of the Federal Reserve presidents participated, I asked one of them, how can he be confident about his exit strategy? This is uncharted territory. And the answer was that, being confident is part of his job description. And so I've decided that his strategy is to pretend to be confident. But he doesn't know what he's going to do if banks start lending that money out. Yeah.
They do have new policy tools to pay interest on reserves. Do you think that's effective enough to?
No, in fact, this came in with the TARP legislation that not only are those reserves sitting in the banks, but the central bank is paying them to hold those reserves, 0.25%. And the idea is that if they start to lend them out, then Bernanke can reel them back in by offering to pay them more for holding the reserves. But that's got positive feedback in it, hasn't it? Because if he pays them more, then what he pays them becomes more reserves. All right? So where does that story end? I don't know. It looks like that could be just explosive. So I don't get it. I don't get how anyone could be confident about that. All right? Anybody else? Yes.
So the current Fed isn't doing what it's supposed to do, but what would be your recommendations for a different monetary arrangement? Do you favor some sort of tightly constrained by fiscal rules central bank, or do you favor a gold standard or free banking?
I favor free banking. In fact, I've got a chart. It's at the end, so I won't pull it up. But essentially is decentralize the business of banking and allow for competitive banks. I would predict, if you have private banks issuing their own notes, that the only way they're going to get them accepted is by tying those bank notes to hard money, most likely gold, okay? Could be silver. But that would, and so the gold or silver would serve as a redemption medium. And if some bank can issue notes and have them circulate and not have that, I don't know how they would do it, but it's more of a prediction than part of the creation of the reform. The reform would just be competitive banking. The prediction is that successful banks are going to have to redeem their notes in gold. Okay. Let me go over here and then I'll come back. Yes.
Can you briefly sketch how you would move that from theory to practice? I mean, how would that actually work out in the economy?
Yeah, that's the big problem. And the only thing that makes it even halfway realizable at least more realizable now than it was in the past, is just because the alternative, namely pressing on with the Federal Reserve, is increasingly a bad choice. Okay, that's really the big thing, and maybe the only thing we have going in our favor. One of the obstacles is that gold has a very stable value if it's used as a medium of exchange. Okay, if you're on a gold standard, then that is a very stable standard. But if you're on a paper standard like we are now, then gold is not at all stable. It becomes an object of speculation. But the speculation isn't about the value of gold, it's about the trouble that the paper standard's in. So how to overcome that, I don't know. How do you switch from gold being a hedge against a bad paper standard to gold being the standard? That's very difficult. It's also difficult even for one country to switch to a gold standard while other countries are not on it. When we had a gold standard, it was the whole Western world. So I can't be optimistic there. I can just tell you those are the problems. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about the preference for free banking and banks issuing their own notes. But presently, about 97% of the money supply, considering the Fed estimates 2/3 of its notes are overseas, is electronic, and about 99% of the transactions by value are electronic. So, would you be, are you talking sort of figuratively when you say notes? Do you mean or electronic equivalent?
Well, yeah, electronic equivalent. I mean, I don't think there's going to be an end to hand-to-hand currency. I think that's here to stay. But yeah, you're certainly right that the electronic component could be handled privately as well, all right? It doesn't require a centralized governance.
So to stop the multiplication of the electronic equivalent with each bank loan or purchase, would you consider that those deposits be treated as bailed property and that the bank acts as a fiduciary for the customer instead of a creditor-debtor relationship?
No, see, I think the way you're conceiving of that problem is that somehow when private banking would be analogous to the private bank would have problems analogous to what the central bank has now. And I don't think that's so. I think the problems you're seeing with the central bank are of its own creation and are unique to a central bank. And I think if you have a system of private banking, then each bank is a check on the other to keep any one of them from getting out of hand. And that if a bank does overexpand in a private environment, private bank environment, then it would do itself in and not do the economy in. It's only when you have a monopoly bank that it does the economy in with booms and busts.
So you're basically saying there'd be no fractional reserve banking, it would be basically 100%?
No, I don't think that's right. I don't think it would. And I know there's some people in the Austrian school that do think that fractional or that 100% reserve should be mandated. But I don't think that's the case. I think that the banks will be a check on each other to keep to not overissue. Okay, Larry White has written a lot on this. George Selgin on free banking, and shows the competitive dynamics that prevent private banks from overissuing in any sort of way that a central bank can overissue. Okay, yeah.
Doing that on a national scale and doing that on the international scale seem to be two very different things. If we were to tomorrow begin to undertake that sort of transition, it's always seemed to me that one of the problems with that is that if there are a bunch of other central banks in nations that we're trading so much with, that they could still cause many of the same problems because of the way that currency exchange rates float and because of how much trade goes on between nations, especially now more than ever. How exactly would you recommend somehow protecting against that? Can you protect against that?
No, yeah, I'm not even sure what protecting against it would mean, but like I mentioned earlier, one of the problems is having a country go on a gold standard when it's the only country on the gold standard. That tends not to work. That when we had a full-bodied gold standard before World War I, it was the whole Western world on the gold standard, and that worked out quite nicely. Thank you. Okay, but for one country to go it alone is very difficult. But of course, other central banks are in trouble too. So it's more likely. I hate to be dark about this, but it's more likely that competitive banking will rise up out of the ashes of central banks, okay, rather than having some legislated smooth transition from central banking to private banking.
I think there were 2 more questions.
Yeah.
And
Then we'll eat.
Do you think, or when do you think, the U.S. dollar will lose its status as the world reserve currency?
Well, that's a hard one, and I used to think any time now, but of course the euro is in bad trouble too. I mean, the euro is sort of the second choice, but it's in bad shape too. And I've heard the U.S. dollar described as the healthiest horse in the glue factory. Okay, so the dollar seems to be holding on, but mainly because the euro is in bad shape too.
Well, we're seeing reports from the IMF switching to a basket of currencies as the world reserve currency.
Mm-hmm.
China, it was gold, and there are 2 other ones.
Mm-hmm.
It was not the euro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can believe it wasn't the euro now, and I have heard about that. I haven't studied it, but a basket of currencies as a world reserve, that might be a better alternative than either dollars or euros.
John, did you have a question?
I don't know if I have a question. Yeah, I'll ask my question.
All right.
It seems like in the modern system, so much of our savings is now not determined by rational, forward-thinking decisions. It's more what my insurance company tells me my rate is and whatever my employer matches
Mm-hmm.
my retirement savings. So a huge chunk of savings is not shifting based on perceptions about the future so
Mhm.
much anymore. And does that dampen some of the
Mhm.
market adjustments we
Mhm.
expect to see under the capital?
I agree with what you pointed out about how saving has gotten institutionalized to that point. But like any market, adjustments happen at the margin. Okay, so it's at the margin where changes in prices or change in interest rate will affect your decisions. And it may be, for instance, that even now, despite the institutional impact on your savings, that with interest rate down to 1%, you just decide to consume more, okay? And that means you're saving less than you otherwise would. That's the kind of adjustment at the margin that the market depends on, and not all the inframarginal aspects of it. Although still what you say could, I'm not saying it's no concern, but the market still works as long as you can have marginal adjustments. Okay? Thank you.
want to thank everybody for coming to this final lecture on the Federal Reserve. If you missed any of our prior lectures, they are available on the Congressman's YouTube page. The first one is Why Was the Fed Created? With Professor George Selgin, which Dr. Garrison did mention, him in his paper with Larry White. That paper is also very interesting if you really like to read academic papers. I know there are a few of us in this room that do that. And the second one was What Does the Fed Do? With Jim Grant. That's also on our YouTube page, and then this one will be posted as well. So thank you again for coming, and please join me in another round of applause for Dr. Garrison.